My family history dissolved in a single afternoon. I usually keep quiet, but this betrayal was too loud to ignore. My parents sold my grandma's antique piano, the one she left only to me, and used the $100,000 to buy my sister a car. When I told Grandma from her hospice bed, she picked up her phone, made one call, and said, "It's time for them to meet my attorney." That sentence changed everything. Before the lawyers and the shouting, there was just the silence of an empty room. 24 hours earlier, I had walked into my parents' living room, expecting the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood. Instead, I found a rectangular void. The 1920s Steinway, the instrument that had taught me how to breathe when the world felt suffocating, was gone. 4 deep indentations in the beige carpet were the only proof it had ever existed. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, where the mahogany curve should have been. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was violent, like a missing limb. I found my parents in the kitchen, casually dissecting a roast chicken. When I screamed about the theft, my father didn't even put down his carving knife. He told me to lower my voice, explaining that Bella needed a reliable vehicle for her new image. They spoke about the transaction as if they had sold a used sofa on Craigslist, not a family heirloom worth a fortune. They truly believed because Grandma was dying, her property was already theirs to liquidate for their golden child. My mother wiped her hands on a dish towel and reached into her purse. She pulled out a checkbook, scribbled quickly, and slid a slip of paper across the granite counter. It was a personal check for $500. She called it a finder's fee for my trouble and told me to buy something nice. I stared at her elegant handwriting, realizing my silence had a price tag, and it was insultingly low. I tore the paper in half and walked out the door. The drive to the hospice center felt like a funeral procession for the living. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I rehearsed comfortable lies, terrified the truth would stop Grandma Eleanor's failing heart. The facility smelled of antiseptic and wilting lilies. When I entered her room, she was awake. Her silver hair spread across the pillow like a halo. She looked frail, but her eyes were sharp. She took one look at my face and demanded the truth before I even sat down. I told her everything, bracing myself for tears. I expected grief, but I witnessed a resurrection of cold fury. Grandma Eleanor didn't weep. Her breathing steadied, and a terrifying calm settled over her features. She reached for the bedside table, with surprising strength, dialed a number she knew by heart, and waited. When the line connected, she didn't say hello. She simply gave the command that would dismantle my parents' lives. "Dry your eyes, Julia," she whispered. "We have a party to prepare for." 2 days later, I sat across from Arthur Sterling in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and rain. He didn't look like the family friend I remembered from childhood barbecues. He looked like a shark in a charcoal suit. He placed a thick leather folder on the wobbly metal table between us. His movements were precise, lacking any wasted energy. I wrapped my hands around a paper cup, trying to stop them from shaking. I asked him if my parents were going to be angry. He corrected me immediately. "Anger is irrelevant when you have leverage." Sterling opened the folder to a document stamped with official seals. He pointed a manicured finger at the property line description. It was the deed to my parents, colonial house in the suburbs. The name listed as owner wasn't my father or mother. It was the Eleanor Whitmore Revocable Trust. He explained that for 20 years, my parents had lived there as tenants at will. They paid no mortgage, no taxes, and no rent. They believed the house was theirs, but belief isn't a legal standing. My entire childhood home was actually borrowed property. The room seemed to tilt. I thought about the expensive kitchen renovation my mother boasted about last Thanksgiving. I remembered my father lecturing me on equity and asset management, while sipping scotch in a study he didn't actually own. They had built a monument to their own success on land that could be pulled out from under them at any moment. Sterling watched me process the information, his expression unreadable. He told me that Grandma Eleanor had kept the deed in the trust specifically for a moment like this. She knew her son too well. He flipped the page to a detailed inventory list. There, highlighted in yellow, was the 1920s Steinway. He explained that, because the piano was scheduled trust property, selling it wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was theft, conversion of assets. A felony given the dollar amount. My parents hadn't just been cruel, they had been criminally stupid. They sold property they didn't own to buy a car they couldn't afford. Sterling tapped the paper with a rhythmic thud. This wasn't a civil dispute anymore. This was the leverage that would break them. I asked if we should call the police or send a letter. Sterling shook his head slowly. He knew about the celebration dinner, scheduled for Friday night. My sister Bella planned to debut her Mercedes to the extended family and business partners. He wanted to serve the papers there. He wanted witnesses. It was a tactical strike designed to maximize humiliation and prevent them from spinning a narrative. We weren't just going to take the house back. We were going to dismantle their reputation in front of everyone they tried to impress. Before he left, Sterling slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table. It was sealed with red wax, looking like something from another century. He told me not to open it until the dinner, right before the main course. He said it was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would ensure my safety when the dust settled. I put the envelope in my bag. It felt heavy, like a loaded gun. I walked back to my car, ready to face my parents with a smile that hid a nuclear warhead. The silver Mercedes arrived on a flatbed truck like a visiting dignitary. Bella stood on the driveway, squealing as the driver lowered the ramp. The car gleamed under the harsh suburban sun, a mirror reflecting her vanity. She ran her hands over the hood, treating the metal with more affection than she had ever shown Grandma. I watched from the kitchen window, clutching the heavy envelope in my purse. Bella caught my eye and smirked, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but understood perfectly. She waved her keys, mocking my silence. Bella cornered me by the garage later, leaning against her new leather seats. She twirled a diamond keychain, asking if I was still driving my rusted sedan. She called it an embarrassment, laughing that if I worked harder, I wouldn't need sentimental junk to feel valuable. The irony tasted like copper. She was driving stolen money on 4 wheels. I forced a tight smile and told her the car suited her perfectly. It was shiny, expensive, and completely hollow inside. Dinner was a masterclass in delusion. My mother served roast beef on the good china, the set reserved for people she actually respected. She poured wine for herself and Dad, leaving my glass empty. Dad pontificated about smart asset management, gesturing with his fork. He called the piano sale a strategic liquidation of dead weight. He claimed Grandma was hoarding old assets that were depreciating in the dark. They clinked glasses, celebrating their brilliance. I chewed my meat, swallowing the urge to scream. My mother found me in the kitchen the next morning. She didn't say hello. Instead, she handed me a chore list for Friday's party. She told me the caterers needed a point person, and she didn't want to be bothered. She suggested I wear something understated, so I wouldn't clash with Bella's dress. I was being demoted from daughter to event staff. I took the list without arguing. It was just more ammunition for the war they didn't know was coming. I visited the hospice center on Thursday night. Grandma Eleanor was weaker, her skin translucent against the sheets. I told her the preparations were complete. I told her about the black dress and the catering list. A faint smile touched her lips. She whispered that pride always comes before the fall. She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. She told me to be brave when the yelling started. I promised I would. I left feeling like a soldier receiving final orders. Friday arrived with oppressive humidity. The house buzzed with energy. Florists carried in white hydrangeas, blocking the hallway. My father paced the living room, checking his watch every 5 minutes. He was nervous, but not about the theft. He was worried about impressing the bank partners, coming to dinner. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, where the piano used to be. He didn't see the empty space anymore. He only saw the stage for his performance. The house felt dangerously volatile. Just before guests arrived, I overheard Dad on the phone in the study. The door was cracked open. He was speaking in his low, confident business voice. He told someone the paperwork would be ready on Monday. He said he was leveraging the home equity to secure the expansion loan. He laughed, saying the house had appreciated beautifully. My stomach dropped. He was planning to borrow against a house he didn't own. They were betting everything on a deed that wasn't theirs. By 7 o'clock, the driveway looked like a luxury car dealership. The silver Mercedes sat on a platform, crowned with a red velvet bow. Guests milled around it, swirling champagne and offering compliments. I stood by the hydrangeas, holding a tray of crab cakes, invisible in my black dress. Bella held court next to the driver's side door, posing for photos. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. The constant flash of cameras blinded me like warning flares. My father ushered guests toward the front steps. He placed a hand on the Mercedes hood, claiming ownership of the moment. He spoke loudly about family values and rewarding excellence. The bank partners nodded, impressed by this display of liquidity. I gripped the silver tray until my knuckles turned white. He was selling a fantasy to secure a loan that would never fund. He looked directly at me, his eyes cold, silently warning me not to ruin the tableau. "A toast," my father bellowed, raising his glass. The chatter died instantly. To Bella, for her bright future. And to my mother Eleanor, whose generosity made this possible before her decline. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. My stomach twisted. He wasn't just stealing her money, he was stealing her agency, painting her as a senile benefactor. Bella beamed, soaking up the applause that belonged to a dying woman. The lie hung in the humid air, thick and suffocating. The chime of the doorbell cut through the applause. It wasn't the polite ring of a late guest, it was a long, insistent press. My mother frowned, gesturing for me to handle it. I set the tray down on a patio table, ignoring the crab cakes that slid off. I walked through the house, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew who was standing on the other side of that door. The waiting was finally over. Before I could reach the foyer, Bella pushed past me. "I'll get it," she announced, breathless with greed. "It's probably the custom plates I ordered." She flung the door open wide, expecting a delivery boy. Instead, she found Arthur Sterling. He stood framed by the porch light, flanked by a grim, faced process server holding a stack of papers. Bella didn't flinch. She smiled dazzlingly at the attorney, assuming he was another admirer, coming to pay tribute to her special night. "Are you here for the presentation?" Bella chirped, stepping back. "You are just in time for the cake." Sterling looked at her with professional detachment. He adjusted his grip on the leather briefcase. "I am here for a presentation, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "But I won't be staying for dessert." Bella didn't hear the warning. She practically dragged the executioner into the living room, oblivious to the sharp blade he carried. The guests turned as the trio entered the main space. My father's smile faltered before he recognized Sterling. Confusion clouded his face, quickly replaced by annoyance. He clearly thought this was a fundraising solicitation. Sterling didn't wait for a greeting. He walked straight to the dining table, pushed aside a platter of untouched oysters, and clicked the latches of his briefcase. The sound echoed like a gunshot in a canyon. "I am not here for the cake, Bella," Sterling announced. My father tried to intervene, laughing nervously about administrative errors to the shocked guests. Sterling ignored him completely and pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket. He pressed play. Grandma's voice, frail but distinct, cut through the crowded room like a siren. She stated clearly that the Steinway was scheduled property and her signature on any bill of sale was a forgery. The bank partners froze, their champagne glasses stopping halfway to their mouths. The celebratory jazz music seemed to curdle in the heavy silence. "This constitutes grand larceny," Sterling said, placing a transcript on the dining table. My mother dropped her linen napkin, her face draining of color. She looked at the guests, stammering about a misunderstanding, but the evidence was vibrating in the air. Sterling explained that the transaction was unauthorized and the proceeds were criminally misappropriated. He pointed a finger at the Mercedes visible through the window. It wasn't a gift anymore. It was evidence. The red bow suddenly looked exactly like crime scene tape. My father found his voice, shouting that Sterling was trespassing in his private residence. Sterling paused, letting the objection hang there before destroying it. "That is the issue, Richard. This isn't your residence." He produced the deed, holding it up for the bankers to see. He announced that the Eleanor Whitmore Trust held sole title. My parents were merely tenants who had violated their lease. The realization hit my father like a physical blow. His entire empire was built on borrowed land he could not hold. The process server stepped forward, shoving a thick stack of documents into my father's chest. 30-day notice to vacate, he said flatly, for cause. The guests began to back away, sensing the radioactive fallout. Bella stopped posing by the window, her confusion turning into panic. She looked from the car to Dad, waiting for him to fix it. But he was staring at the paperwork, his hands trembling violently. The man who always had an answer was suddenly struck mute by the truth. Desperation makes people ugly. My mother's eyes locked onto me across the room. She rushed over, gripping my arm hard enough to bruise. "Julia," she hissed, loud enough for the lawyers to hear. Tell them you agreed to the sale. Tell them it was a family decision. It was their final play. They wanted me to perjure myself to save their reputation." She dug her nails into my skin, demanding I play the dutiful invisible daughter one last time. The room waited for my submission. I looked at the woman who had charged me a finder's fee for my own inheritance. I looked at the father who planned to mortgage a house he didn't own. I pulled my arm from her grasp. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You stole it. You lied to Grandma, and you lied to me." I turned to Sterling. "I never authorized anything." The bridge between us didn't just burn, it incinerated in the heat of the truth. Sterling nodded, accepting my testimony. He turned back to my parents with a final piece of information. "Regarding the piano," he said, closing his briefcase. "We tracked the buyer. He is a client of mine who respects provenance. He revealed that the trust had already arranged to repurchase it. But the debt for that purchase now fell on them. The piano was coming home. The money for the Mercedes, however, was gone. Burned on an asset they would lose by tomorrow morning. The exodus of the guests was swift and brutal. The bank partners didn't even say goodbye. They simply walked past my father, like he was a stranger. I watched the taillights of their luxury sedans fade down the driveway, taking the expansion loan with them. My father stood in the open doorway, his hand still raised in a frozen wave, looking like a captain going down with a ship made of paper. The festive hydrangeas now looked like funeral arrangements. The heavy silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Bella broke the silence with a shriek that shattered the last of the party atmosphere. She realized the implication of the misappropriated funds before my parents did. She turned on Dad, screaming that he had promised her the car was safe, that it was hers by right. She didn't care about the theft or Grandma's betrayal. She only cared about the status symbol sitting in the driveway. Her vanity was a black hole that swallowed her empathy. She threw her keys at him, the metal striking his chest with a dull, heavy thud. Sterling didn't flinch at the domestic violence. He simply checked his watch and delivered the financial autopsy. He explained that since the car was purchased with stolen funds, it was technically contraband. They had 24 hours to return the vehicle and wire the full amount back to the trust. If they failed, he would file criminal charges for elder abuse and grand larceny by Monday morning. The math was cruel. The car had already depreciated the moment it left the lot. They were underwater on a loan they never even signed. My mother collapsed onto the sofa, weeping into her hands. It wasn't a cry of remorse. It was the terrified sob of a woman realizing her social standing had evaporated. She looked up at me, her mascara running in dark streaks. "How could you?" she whispered, the accusation thick with venom. "You planned this. You wanted to humiliate us." She wasn't seeing the crime they committed, she only saw the consequence I had unveiled. In her twisted narrative, I was the villain for turning on the lights in a room full of monsters. Dad found his rage then, stepping toward me with clenched fists. He loomed over me, using the physical intimidation that had worked for 2 decades. "This is my house," he roared, veins bulging in his neck. "I raised you. I fed you. And this is how you repay me." He tried to make me feel small, to force me back into the corner, where the silent daughter belonged. But the fear didn't come. I looked at his red face, and realized he was just a tenant shouting at the landlord. Sterling stepped between us, not as a shield, but as a referee. He reminded my father that aggressive behavior toward the beneficiary could accelerate the eviction process. My father froze at the word, beneficiary. He looked from the lawyer to me, connecting the dots for the first time. He realized I wasn't just the snitch. I was the one holding the keys. The power in the room shifted so violently, it made my ears pop. He backed away, his bluster deflating into a pathetic, confused whimper. The silence was deafening. My mother tried the soft approach, wiping her face and reaching for my hand. Her touch felt cold and clammy. "Julia, baby," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We can fix this. Just tell Mr. Sterling you were confused. Tell him we talked about the piano. We're your family." She was asking me to commit perjury, to save the lifestyle that excluded me. She wanted me to burn my integrity to keep them warm. The envelope in my purse felt heavy against my hip. A reminder of the woman who actually loved me. I pulled my hand away, as if she were contagious. The decision wasn't hard, it was inevitable. "I am not confused, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her manipulation. "I am the only one here seeing things clearly." I told her that family doesn't steal from the dying. I told her that family doesn't sell heirlooms to buy sports cars. I refused to be their accomplice anymore. I watched the hope die in her eyes, replaced by a cold, hard hatred. I had finally severed the cord. I was done. Sterling closed his briefcase with a finality that echoed in the empty room. He looked at me with a nod of respect, acknowledging the line I had just drawn in the sand. "I'll give you a moment to say your goodbyes," he said to me, ignoring my parents entirely. "The eviction notice stands. 30 days. He walked out the front door, leaving me alone with 3 strangers who used to be my family. The air in the room was toxic, filled with the wreckage of their lies. I didn't blink. The front door clicked shut, sealing us in a tome of vibrating silence. Then Bella exploded. She kicked the coffee table, sending a crystal bowl crashing onto the polished hardwood. She screamed that I was jealous, a bitter spinster trying to ruin her life, because I couldn't attract a rich husband. She didn't care about the eviction or the fraud. She only cared that her status symbol was being repossessed. She paced the room like a caged animal, tears wrecking her professional makeup. She pointed a shaking finger at me, vowing she would never forgive me. I looked at her, realizing I didn't want her forgiveness. My father scrubbed his face with his hands, the adrenaline fading into a gray exhaustion. He started pacing, muttering about legal loopholes and temporary injunctions. He looked at me, not as a daughter, but as an obstacle to be managed. He told me to call Sterling back, to tell him I was emotional and mistaken. He said we could work out a payment plan for the piano, something manageable over 10 years. he still believed he was in charge of the negotiation. He didn't understand that the negotiation had ended 5 years ago, when Grandma signed the trust documents. Mom sat on the arm of the sofa, blotting her eyes with a crumpled cocktail napkin. She switched tactics from rage to martyrdom. She listed every sacrifice they had made. The braces, the state college tuition, the roof over my head. She asked how I could sleep at night, knowing I was making them homeless. She painted herself as the victim of an ungrateful child. Her voice was soft, designed to trigger the conditioned guilt I had carried for decades. But the guilt didn't come. It had been replaced by the clear memory of the empty space in the carpet. When silence met their pleading, my father's temper flared again. He walked over to the fireplace, leaning heavily against the mantel he didn't own. He told me that if I didn't fix this by morning, I was no longer part of this family. He said I would be cut off, disinherited, and dead to them. The threat hung in the air, absurd and toothless. He was threatening to cut me off from a fortune that didn't exist. He was threatening to exile me from a kingdom that had already crumbled. I almost laughed at the dark irony. I reached into my purse and pulled out the cream-colored envelope Sterling had given me. The red wax seal cracked with a satisfying snap under my thumb. I unfolded the document, the paper crisp and heavy. It wasn't just a copy of the deed. It was an appointment of successor trustee. Grandma hadn't just secured the assets. She had secured the executioner. I smoothed the paper on the dining table, right where the stolen piano used to sit. I told them to read it. I told them to see exactly who held their future in their hands. My father snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the legalese frantically. His face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. He read the clause that granted the trustee sole discretion over occupancy and asset liquidation. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. He was looking at his landlord. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it capsized. Mom leaned over his shoulder, reading the words that sealed their fate. She gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. "You have 30 days," I said, my voice calm and unrecognizable to my own ears. "But I am amending the terms." I told them that any damage to the property would result in immediate removal by the sheriff. I told them the Mercedes keys needed to be on the table in 5 minutes. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't asking. I was commanding. I watched Bella freeze mid-sob, realizing that her tantrums no longer held currency here. The hierarchy of the house had been inverted. The invisible child was now the only one with a voice. Bella rushed to me then, grabbing my hands with clammy fingers. The malice was gone, replaced by desperate pragmatism. She asked where she was supposed to go. She asked how she would get to work without the car. She pleaded with me to let her keep it, just for a few more weeks. She promised to be nicer, to include me, to be a real sister. It was pathetic. She was trying to buy my mercy with a currency she had never possessed. I pulled my hands away. I told her the bus schedule was available online. My father turned away from the table, unable to look at me. He walked toward the crystal decanter on the sideboard, his hand shaking as he reached for the scotch. He needed to numb the humiliation. He needed to retreat into the bottle, like he always did, when reality became inconvenient. He reached for the glass stopper, the clink of crystal ringing out in the quiet room. "Don't," I said sharply. He paused, his hand hovering. I told him that the alcohol was trust property. He wasn't authorized to consume it. It was petty, perhaps, but necessary. He stared at the bottle, then at me. A myriad of emotions crossed his face: rage, shame, disbelief. But he didn't pour the drink. He dropped his hand to his side, defeated by his own child. He walked out of the room without a word. The heavy footsteps of a man who had lost his kingdom. Mom followed him, casting one last terrified look in my direction. I stood alone in the center of the room. The silence within the house wasn't oppressive anymore. It was clean. I had burned the bridge, and the fire kept me warm. The wind at the cemetery cut through my wool coat, carrying the scent of damp earth and finality. 3 months had passed since the dinner party, and my parents stood at the edge of the grave, like unwanted guests. They wore their old expensive clothes, but the hems were frayed, and my father's shoes needed a shine. They didn't stand in the front row. They hovered in the back, separated from the mourners by a gulf of shame I had dug for them. Bella stood beside them, shivering in a dress that was too thin for the season. The Mercedes was a distant memory, replaced by a monthly bus pass and a shift manager's schedule at a clothing boutique. She didn't look at me. She stared at the coffin with a mixture of grief and resentment, mourning the bank account as much as the grandmother. When the service ended, they walked toward the parking lot without saying a word. We were strangers sharing nothing but DNA. I drove back to the house alone. The key turned in the lock with a heavy, satisfying click. Inside, the air no longer smelled of my mother's cloying perfume or my father's cigar smoke. It smelled of lemon oil and open windows. I had removed their pretension room by room. The crystal decanters were gone, donated to charity. The beige carpet with the indentations had been ripped up, revealing the original hardwood floors underneath. The house finally felt like it could breathe. In the center of the living room, the empty space had been filled. Sterling had kept his promise, tracking down the collector and negotiating the buyback with funds from the trust. The 1920s Steinway sat on the dark wood, its mahogany case gleaming under the afternoon sun. It looked larger than I remembered. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a survivor. I ran my fingers over the keys, feeling the cold ivory that had waited for me to find my courage. I sat on the bench, adjusting the height. For years, I believed my worth was tied to how small I could make myself to accommodate their egos. I thought silence was the price of admission to this family. But looking at the empty walls where their portraits used to hang, I realized the silence had been a cage. Grandma Eleanor hadn't left me this piano to play background music. She left it so I would finally learn how to make some noise. I placed my hands on the keys, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't play a complex concerto to prove my brilliance. I played a simple C major scale, the first thing Grandma ever taught me. The sound resonated through the empty house, rich and warm, and undeniably mine. I hit a wrong note on the way down, a sharp accidental that clashed with the harmony. I didn't stop or apologize. I played the discord loud and clear, and for the first time, the house listened.